Lely from SOAS, who is a professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations. Her most recent book, Time in the Shadows, Confinement in Counterinsurgencies, drew on interviews with former detainees of Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo Bay, and various Israeli detention camps and prisons. Military officers, guards, interrogators, as well as a large number of archival sources, to show the continuities and practices of detention in liberal counterinsurgencies from the Boer War until today. Her current research project engages the politics and political economy of war and militaries as it intersects with infrastructure, logistics and transport, with specific focus on the Middle East. And she's just wrapped up a much smaller project on the politics of pleasure. So thank you very much for being here with us today via Skype, and I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for asking me to be here. In some ways, what I want to talk about actually does not necessarily fall in the pre or post-Snowden era, because some of the research that I've conducted doesn't necessarily, it seems to deal with issues that have been continuous and have in fact bedeviled the kind of work that we do. And these have to do with people's willingness to speak with you, the ethical questions that are tied into interviewing people who on the one hand are either completely powerless and or have been subjected to extraordinary violence inside prisons or through detention processes, or on the other hand, people who are actually powerful and have had control over detainees' well-being, livelihoods, life, actually, in many instances. And so what I want to do is to reflect a little bit, not about the technical issues around this, but the ethical ones, because I think that in some senses our methodological research concerns and ethical ones are completely intertwined, and in some senses should not be, they're inseparable and should not be separated. And part of the reason that I believe this is because I think that a kind of an adherence to a set of ethical concerns while we're conducting this form of research, in fact allows us to gather information that is far more useful and in some ways, and it cleaves far more to not only questions of truth, verifiability, etc., reliability, but also to questions of justice, which I think should be something that we consider. Now, how would I define an ethical stance in while we're conducting research in conditions of extreme violence or high security? I have been conducting this form of research with vulnerable populations for quite a long time. Research with more powerful actors, which is something that I did with my counterinsurgency project, and now I'm continuing to do with my ports and maritime project, tends to be very different in some ways. But the singular, most important question that one has to ask when conducting this form of research with either vulnerable populations or populations such as interrogators, torturers, guards, military personnel who've been involved in forms of detention is, what are the power relations in the moment of research? So how am I, as a researcher, located vis-a-vis the person with whom I'm conducting an interview, or whose livelihood and lives are the subject of my ethnographic research? And in some instances, in fact, archival material or leaked material, for example, WikiLeaks stuff, which may not necessarily have been redacted to protect the names of people, and therefore, in fact, even dealing with archival material, how do we deal with vulnerable populations, and what are the power relations there? And I think that it is extraordinarily important for us to constantly reflect on the set of power relations that obtain in that moment of research. Because in some ways, that calculation the calculation of how am I related in terms of power, and what sort of power symmetry or asymmetry do I stand with my interlocutor, ends up affecting the kinds of things that, the kinds of information we choose to gather, the kinds of information we choose to write about, how we choose to analyze it, and to what extent do our interlocutors have a chance to tell us whether or not we want to publish this material or not. And I think that that is absolutely crucial. So one of the things that I have tried to do since beginning my research, which was originally with Palestinian refugees living in refugee camps, kind of permanent refugee camps that have been around in Lebanon for decades now, and later with people who had been detainees, was to always be profoundly aware that not only was I, as a researcher, in a position of power, because of course I can dictate the extent to which the narratives that these people are offering to me, how it's shaped and how it's published, but also, ultimately, what responsibility do I have in conveying the stories that they have truthfully and in the ways in which they want me to. And I think that it's crucial for us to constantly think about that question and to actually ask our interlocutors about the kinds of what they want of us. Because, of course, they are willingly giving some of their time to us as researchers. And in those instances where they do, we should ask them and they're giving us valuable material for research. We should ask them what they will demand of us in return, because I think that the work of research should be a reciprocal process in which we at least try in some ways to reciprocate in a convivial and collegial way by respecting what they want. So some of the things that are, I think, important is, once you've written a passage up about the experiences of somebody who's powerless, if you can run it by them before publication, to give them a chance to see how their words are being, or how their lives are being represented, I think that's a crucial and significant and hugely important ethical but also methodological task. Interviewing or working with unsavory, let's say, characters is a very different kind of proposition. And there's a great deal that's been written by anthropologists, in fact, about how to, we are supposed to be, if we're doing ethnographic work or if we are conducting interviews, we have to have a certain degree of sympathy and empathy for our interlocutors. But how do you go on ahead and show sympathy or empathy for somebody who, for example, in many instances, and when I was doing research, who admits to having tortured someone, or having subjected them, let's say, to forms of interrogation that perhaps doesn't necessarily fall under the category of torture, but which sounds really pretty horrendous. And I think that question of how do you, on the one hand, maintain a sort of research empathy for your research interlocutor, but at the same time maintain a certain amount of distance, is probably one of the hardest things one can do. And what I have found in those instances is to try to maintain as much fidelity as possible to the words that they have given me in the interviews they've conducted with me, and in some ways at least try to not in my analysis to allow for their own words to in some ways show what they have done and how they have done it. And from an analysis to, if I am doing a critical analysis, if I find that some of the stories that they have told me are not necessarily truthful, to at least be able to verify and provide reliable counter-narratives to theirs. Because I think that this form of verifiability and reliability, which is often very hard to secure, particularly in conditions of conflict, are nevertheless really, really crucial for the work itself to maintain a degree of scholarly integrity, but also an ethical one. There are little things around this also that matter, little technical issues around this that matter, which I think that have become much more significant in more recent times. Questions of anonymity, questions of encryption, questions of providing a certain degree of technical security are also ethical questions. actually happened to be where the material that I've collected on a laptop or whatever has been viewed by security people. But I have had friends who've worked in Israel-Palestine who, upon being stopped at the border by Israeli security, have had the entire content of their laptop downloaded onto Israeli security servers. And so in some ways, the material that you have on your laptop ends up becoming the property of the Israeli state, which might be using it in all sorts of ways. This is not simply a question of technical some sort of technical proficiency in trying to maintain your information. It is also an ethical, again, question, because what we're doing is the kind of material we gather ends up being very crucial to those in power, that they can use it in whatever way they want. So I think, again, going back and summarizing, because I think my time is probably up, for me, the central question of research should always be that calculus of power, not only of me, my relationship with my research interlocutors, but also of the interlocutors' sort of larger positionality in the world. And I think that situational calculus should always be at the forefront of our minds at the moment that we're conducting research. Again, not only because of the methodological integrity of our work, but because those ethical questions of remaining honest to the words of our interlocutors, even as we subject it to critical scrutiny, is hugely important, and I think it's hugely ethically incumbent on us. I'll be happy to actually answer more specific questions about research tactics or techniques later if you're interested. But I think this particular issue of power symmetries and asymmetries in research and the ways in which it dictates the interrelationship between ethical research and the methodologies of research is something that I think becomes more and more important the more and more we delve into controversial research or research that is taking place in eras of conflict and high security. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
My rendition programme, and I don't want to spend too much time going over the detail of that, but very briefly, what I did with my co-researcher Sam Raphael was map the flights that travel around the world carrying kidnapped people to deposit them in god-awful jails and torture them. Some of those jails were CIA owned and run, some were outsourced. And the sort of findings that we were able to develop through looking at flight data were then later corroborated by the Senate's Electoral Committee on Intelligence's investigation into the CIA's torture, the executive summary of which is 500 pages long and redacted. That was released at the end of 2014. But most of the work we did was before that. And to be honest, there's a lot of luck to how I ended up doing this research. When I started the project, I had no idea that I would be able to get hold of flight data pertaining to the aircraft that carried these people around the world. And that only really happened through development of a relationship with the legal action charity Reprieve, who represented a number of victims of the CIA rendition program and also people who ended up in Guantanamo Bay. So when I started the project with Sam back in 2011, we had this peculiar idea that we would look at regional variations in how rendition was being used. And we contacted Reprieve because we knew they'd done some investigative work around particular individuals, and they very kindly met us, two brilliant investigators, not academics but human rights investigators and litigators. And they very patiently tolerated the ignorance and inexperience of two, at the time, fairly inexperienced academics working on this subject. This conversation developed over a number of months, and eventually they told us that they had a huge amount of air traffic control data relating to some of the aircraft that had been used. So these are private jets. If you have enough money, you can hire them yourself. But they were hired by the CIA to carry out these renditions precisely because they were privately owned and therefore undetectable and untraceable back to the CIA, or that was the theory. Plane spotters and investigative journalists dealt with that, and then people like me came along to data. So Reprieve had a large amount of the data, but not all of it. The rest of the flight data, which they didn't have but knew existed, was held by the Council of Europe that had carried out investigations of the role of European states in rendition. And through various negotiations, the Council of Europe investigator agreed to share the flight data with us. That took months, absolutely ages, of Reprieve brokering discussions with them and basically reassuring this investigator that we were serious academics who would treat the data well. And that, I suppose, was my first lesson for all of us about doing this kind of work. It can take a really long time to build relationships of trust that you need to access people who might be able to give you data to do research on pretty sensitive, high-profile and secretive issues of national security concern. Why were we credible? Well, Reprieve conversed with us over a long period of time, and we were able to dispel their assumption that academics tend to take the mickey out of NGOs by exploiting them for their expertise, their data, and then using it for their own publications and careers. And by spending lots of time talking with us and testing us out really to see if they could trust us, they eventually felt able to not just share their own work with us, but broker for us with the Council of Europe investigator. So we got the flight data. To cut a very long and very dull story short, we produced a spreadsheet that has 11,000 rows of data. It's really boring. It's the journey of one aircraft from location A to location B. So that is one row of data. And all the data in the data set is by 40 or so aeroplanes that were used for transporting rendition victims. The vast majority of those 11,000 rows of data are completely uninteresting, meaningless, and relate to entirely legitimate practices that go on all the time because people can hire these aircraft to just do normal corporate business. So a lot of the data is really boring, really irrelevant, and our job was to figure out which was the interesting data. We did this by ordering the data by its aircraft number and date, and this gives you then patterns of a particular aircraft flying over a period of 5 to 10 days or so. And the rendition ones are obvious because they take on certain routes, they stop off in certain locations where we knew prisoners were being held. An obvious one is obviously Afghanistan, and then other places as well that we were able to track. The data on itself and these flight circuits, as we call them, in and of themselves are not very interesting, but if you can triangulate them with other corroborating evidence, so testimony from victims, human rights investigative work, then you are able to prove that a particular individual was on a particular plane and therefore their rendition really did happen, and it's not a figment of the imagination of Human Rights Watch or whoever else. That ended up being really valuable because it meant that investigators representing victims could use this data in litigation to seek redress, damages, prove these things happened, and in some cases prosecute states. So our data has been used in the European Court of Human Rights in litigation against Romania, Lithuania and Poland for operating prisons on behalf of the CIA. It's also been used in high courts in a number of countries, again, where redress and damages have been sought for victims. It has also been used by some of the defence lawyers for people in Guantanamo. And what you may not know about them is those defence lawyers, if they talk to people about their litigation on behalf of those detainees, they will be imprisoned by the US authorities. So we can share information with them. We can ask them questions that they might want to bring into evidence in those sham trials that go on at Guantanamo, but they're not allowed to tell anything to us about the process. Lesson number 2, when you know that you are working with people who are in those sensitive situations, it is very important that you never violate those rules. So it's been hugely important that we don't correspond with them, we don't contact them, unless it's to deliver information to them that they can use or not use, it's up to them. Never ask the questions, we're extremely careful, because if we do, those defence lawyers, who by the way are members of the US military, ironically enough, will end up in prison for an extremely long time. Some other things we've tried to do is freedom of information requests to the British government about its role. And these are, I haven't done this work, Sam has done this work, but these are highly entertaining in terms of the number of no's we get back and the accusations that we are vexatious litigants. But Sam has found extremely clever ways of submitting freedom of information requests to determine that specific documents exists. So it's not necessarily about getting documents, but it's about establishing whether there is a paper trail in government about particular things. So a good example would be he's trying to find out what the resourcing and transaction arrangements are between the UK and the US government over the UK islands, the Diego Garcia territory in the Indian Ocean. How is that land being used? What are the arrangements? And by making these freedom of information requests, he's established that certain documents actually exist. So this is, again, very painstaking, quite dull work, but it's part of building up these tiny fragments of information to be able to tell a more complete story about what's going on in these kinds of arrangements. My time is almost up, so I suppose I just want to end by really underlining the fact that the research we've done couldn't have been possible without really generous and trusting support from human rights investigators and litigators. Those relationships are extremely valuable, they're really hard work, they take years, but they have taught me so much about what doing decent research is actually about. They've taught me far more than anything I ever learned in a methods class. I do actually teach methods, so I hope I'm doing a better job than my teachers did. But I think it's so important that those relationships I built with those organisations are reciprocal. And not about me and my academic agendas and my promotions, my publications and my impact. They are actually about us being able to do something together for what I consider to be a greater good, which is something that I mentioned before. It's about justice and about maintaining the rights of those people who are at the centre of this research. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie.
Okay, there we go. So I'll just give you a kind of a brief kind of background for how I started doing this. I started hacking at the age of 9. Went to school like everybody else. I didn't really like it, and I went to university, which is 2 of my wonderful academics behind as well. And then from university, I kind of developed this passion for hacking. I'd always had this kind of avenue that I wanted to go down. However, I couldn't find a way to get into it. There was always a grey area when it was spoke about. When I used to hack companies when I was younger to inform them about the vulnerabilities, it was always the legal steps would come first. They wouldn't really understand what you've actually done. So that's kind of the avenue that I went to, and then I started getting into cybersecurity, and yeah, so this here is the kind of terrorist defense program that I'm building with some academics like Steve from Leeds Beckett University. What this is doing is monitoring terrorists around the world to within 2 meters of where they actually are, so we can actually monitor their communication via publicly available feeds. So we can see some of the data. If I go over to here, and then I do node index. So we can actually see some of the stuff that they're actually saying. So if I can make it slightly bigger, you guys can actually see. So this is communication that's just publicly available. So I'm not monitoring any private communication, I'm not going into any privacy or any data laws. People are always tweeting about their lives. They wake up in the morning, they go to Starbucks, vice versa. What I'm actually doing is I'm tracking and monitoring keywords or hashtags that are happening on Twitter. So we could change this script right now to put Sheffield University. If you guys tweeted in the audience, you'd see that appear live. So what we're using is kind of the Twitter, the horse feed that's available through several back and forth communications. They allow me to have access to it, so I can monitor millions and millions and millions of messages that go on every single second. So what I'm looking for is that one individual, that guy that likes to go onto Twitter and pause with his weapons and likes to pause with his arsenal, and then who he's connected with in his Twitter profiles. So when we go to his followers, or who he's previously corresponded with, we can then build up a profile of any known terrorists or any terrorists that within that kind of cell online. And then what I'm actually doing is then piping this data out live onto this feed. So I hate PowerPoint. I really hate it. It's horrible. I like visualization. I like showing people what I'm thinking inside my head. So I came up with this kind of this program using some of the Twitter framework that was available. I adapted it to pipe my information into here, so then we can actually look where people are talking around the world about terrorism and terrorist-related activity. So you'll notice on the left-hand side there's different colour patterns. It's quite slow at the moment, edge on search. So the people that are actually in red are people that post extreme content. That's their own content. They post about bombs, they post about kind of like schematics, they post about anything to do with terrorism-related activity. The people in yellow are the people that tend to write their own content, however they tend to distribute other people's content. So let's say if I write something about like what I'm doing, I'm going to, I don't know, do something illegal, them guys would then like retweet that and then add something to it, say like, yeah, do it, egg them on essentially. And then people that are actually grey, so these people here, there's people like me and you that tend to retweet the news, or we'll be browsing Twitter and we'll come across something that we find interesting and then we just retweet it and then move on. So what I actually did was I'm piping the data into here to actually show if there's a build-up of activity in a specific area. There's many, many months, maybe even a year or two yet before this is completed to my standard that I want. So then I'm able to build up like a current threat ratio around a specific area to show where an attack is potentially likely imminent. Now in the United Kingdom, I mean, we act on something like 17.5%. You can find this out online. So if there's some kind of terrorist activity that's been reported, that's what we kind of act upon if there's more data. So yeah, so this is the kind of software that I tend to build. I'd like to show you another one as well to move on to. It's Norse Code. Wait to this to load. This gives you a kind of understanding, again visually, the amount of attacks that are happening at any given moment in time. Just wait for the old danger on. There we go. So what we're actually seeing now is live cyber attacks around the world that are happening right this second. There's people hacking email servers, there's people hacking, let's see what we've got. Microsoft servers, we've got some NetBIOS, Telnet, SMTP ports, XScan file systems. So these are just hackers around the world now attacking other countries. Now what you'll actually tend to find is it's not just people like me and you, it's actual governments that tend to launch attacks as well. So with this software, we're able to look up IP addresses. So obviously, like an educational institute like Sheffield will have a blockchain of IP addresses that are registered to Sheffield, and that would be publicly accessible. So we can actually see that information to see who owns these IP addresses. So, for instance, an academic network would run on what we call JANET, which is a joint academic network. So what we're actually seeing is it's not just public infrastructure. It's not just people like Microsoft Corporation, for example, or Google, for example, or servers rented. We're actually seeing governments launch attacks against this infrastructure. So the prime example, a lot of people think that China is actually the main distributor of network attacks. That's incorrect. It's actually between Russia and the US. So they're actually moving up at the moment. So that being said, I mean, right now, if we look at the bottom left, we can actually see there's 346 attacks that have been launched by US government IP addresses since we've just been studying. And they're actually moving up above Russia and Switzerland. So let's do any questions if you guys would like to ask, and then we can build it around what you guys want to know
We'll
about.
do the questions at the end.
Yeah?
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, no
We're going to do
problem.
everyone at the same time.
All right.
Discussion. Is that okay?
Yeah, so if we move back to some of the actual tweets that we can see, what we tend to find is as well is it's fresh accounts. So I'm actually working with Twitter at the moment to actually identify the ISIS accounts and actually get them shut down in 24 hours of them being made. But we tend to find that the average person that tweets, they make around about, so we can just see that, they make around about 17 accounts after they get banned, still distributing content. And we tend to see it's the same content that's been posted. So it's again shutting down an account and remaking an account. So from like a journalist perspective of how to kind of keep yourself safe, I mean, who's heard of an app called Telegram? Anyone heard of that? Some academics believe that it's being intercepted, however, it's not. It's very secure. I wouldn't use WhatsApp if you was going abroad to actually transfer information. I'd use Telegram. And in regards to kind of keeping yourself safe online as well, it's just use virtual private network. Literally don't do anything unless you're on a virtual private network. Everything's getting logged, everything's being monitored. So this was just flagged up then as actually being an ISIS account. So we just saw that real time now. So then we can actually go through his kind of content and see what he's actually posting about. There is another 4 accounts there that have just been found as well, just in this 5 minutes of us talking. At any one given time, I think it's 36,000 accounts at any given one time distributing this content and making fresh content. Yeah, so that concludes.
Thank you very much, Jamie.
For organizing this workshop was to bring together researchers to address what we see as two related yet seemingly, and seemingly with a question mark there, opposite challenges of steadying power in the current era of secrecy and transparency. And what I want to talk about today is less the techniques of doing research, but more a little bit about how do we conceptualize secrecy and transparency and the relation to each other and their relation to our research and the researching power, and especially state power, in this age of secrecy and transparency. So my main research project at the moment is a study of the shifting nature of secrecy, or as I have more recently come to call it, speakability, around the practices of torture and assassination in the US war on terror. And the key question in the project is how did torture, and specifically the justification of, or the question of the permissibility of the practices that we call torture, become speakable after 9/11? So I'll say, what does that mean? And then I'll come back to secrecy and transparency. So as we all know, America's post-9/11 war on terror has been distinguished by the open use of torture and assassination, an explicit defiance of contemporary human rights norms and international law. This use of forbidden practices after 9/11 cannot be seen as completely surprising, given the history of their use throughout the 20th century. You can think perhaps of the School of the Americas, where the CIA trained Latin American paramilitary squads in the arts of torture and disappearance. But what's new here is that we all know that this is going on, that we all know that torture is happening, and it's openly being debated in the media, in the legal sphere, and in the political sphere. And I would argue that this situation goes beyond what you even might call an open secret, right? You could say that the existence of the School of the Americas and that people were being trained at the School of the Americas in the arts of torture was an open secret. What we have now is something different, I think. It's not just that the practice of torture has been exposed, but it has been, to greater or lesser degrees, acknowledged and even defended. In contrast, therefore, while the role of the CIA in Latin America in the 1980s, for example, was an open secret, right? It was known to those who were in the know, which for much of the latter half of the 20th century included pretty much anyone who wanted to find out. There was neither official acknowledgement nor justification of these practices, right? The practice of torture before 9/11 in the US was always subject to official denial. After 9/11, however, the legal and moral permissibility of torture suddenly seemed to become an open question. Debate erupted in the public sphere over both the efficacy and the legal and ethical permissibility of torture. Popular magazines like Newsweek, The Atlantic, and The Economist published cover stories arguing for and against the practice. Prominent philosophers and lawyers came out publicly not only in favor of the permissibility of torture, but also of its legalization. The New York Times would write that torture had become a topic of conversation in bars, on commuter trains, and at dinner tables. Meanwhile, American government officials sought to develop an explicit legal framework for the legal regulation of extraordinary practices, such as waterboarding, sleep deprivation, and physical confinement, practices that had previously always generally been called torture. And so that's the project I'm working on, and I'm trying to explain what I call this new speakability, both within the state and in the sphere of public debate in the US after 9/11. And asking the question, how is the boundary between what's speakable and what's unspeakable, what's thinkable and what's unthinkable, what's constructed, how is this boundary constructed and maintained, and how does the boundary change over time? And so this is sort of about what can be said in the realm of public discourse, which is a little bit different from secrecy. But I'm going to argue that it's really intertwined with changing conditions of secrecy and transparency. And part of the answer to this question, I think, has to do with the changing conditions under which states relate to knowledge and power in the contemporary world. What I mean by this is that the conditions under which state secrecy is both made possible and made necessary have been changing over time. And part of this has to do with the spread of practices of exposure, right, which is both a political practice, if you think of leaks, of whistleblowers, of projects of documentation of state abuses, right, as engaged in by human rights organizations and by researchers. Some of the researchers we've had speaking today engage in these very practices of exposure of state secrets. But at the same time, it's also a technological practice. And the nature of what's possible, both in terms of exposure and in keeping secrets, changes as technologies change. Right? So you can think of, for example, the difference between WikiLeaks, where you can upload, I was going to say megabytes, it's not, it's like gigabytes or terabytes or something of data, right? Sort of pushing a button, versus if you read like the memoirs of Daniel Ellsberg, right? And sort of talking about the Pentagon Papers and how these were exposed, and it was a matter of sneaking out a few pages every night and photocopying them and sneaking them back. Right? Just the technological situation is very different in terms of maintaining state secrecy now versus 40 years ago. But exposure, of course, is not something that exists on its own, right? Exposure, the idea that you can have a practice of exposure is predicated on the idea that you have state secrecy, that there's something that is kept from the public that should be exposed. Conversely, right, sort of the nature of state secrecy itself is predicated on the idea that there might be exposure, right? That there are things that the government, or, we could be talking about corporations, but I'm going to talk about the state for now, wants to stop from being exposed. So you have to think about, right, exposure and secrecy as operating in relation to one another. And so what I want us to think about today is the question of how we as researchers should think about these concepts being related, right? Secrecy and transparency as related concepts and as sort of intermeshed practices, and subsequently how we should relate to these, sort of as problems and as perhaps opportunities, or perhaps both, as we go about doing our research, right? Both that these lead to methodological difficulties for us that we have to deal with, but also conceptual difficulties, right? Sort of how do we conceptualize secrecy and transparency as things that are happening in the world, and that are changing over time, and that I want to suggest that should perhaps be part of the object of study itself, right? That it's not just that secrecy is a block to our research, right? So that there's knowledge out there that we want to get that's being kept from us, but that the practice of secrecy itself and the way that is maintained and the way that it changes over time is an important political and technological practice that we ought to pay more attention to. So returning to my research project on the speakability of torture, so I suggest there's been a rise in the speakability of certain things which I would argue had previously been consigned to the realm of state secrecy, meaning official unspeakability. Again, right? Sort of sometimes these were open secrets. It's not that they were known, but they're officially unspeakable. And I would argue that the current era has been characterized by both a rise in secrecy, as various states have been engaging in practices of reclassification of previously released documents to an unprecedented degree. Right, this has been happening in Britain, in the US. There's just news that came out that Israel has basically reclassified their entire state archives. And as well, that the current administration, the Obama administration in the US, has been called by some to be the most prone to secrecy in recent history. So at the same time you have the rise of secrecy, you also have the rise of new practices of transparency going on at the very same time, right? So the rise of exposure and technological exposures, of massive document leaks and so forth. And so again, I would suggest this raises both conceptual and theoretical questions. That how do we make sense of what's going on here in terms of the changes of what's happening with secrecy and transparency and exposure, and what sorts of methodological challenges does this present to us as researchers who want to study state power or state abuses, or the construction of secrecy and exposure themselves as important practices of the state. So how do we adjust our research practices and conceptualizations to deal with these challenges? So I want to suggest a few things. First, right, sort of always be aware that secrecy is not the same thing as unknowability, and it's also not the same thing as unspeakability. Right? Secrecy is not just something that's unknown. It's something that can't be spoken in certain ways, or has certain types of social or political boundaries built around it. So for example, we have the realm of state secrets. And while some sorts of state secrets do indeed consist of bits of information that may be revealed or not revealed, right? You think of the Rendition Project piecing together bits of information to reveal a pattern of rendition flights, right? That was known were happening, but sort of couldn't be proved when or where, right? So that's an exposure of specific pieces of information. On the other hand, or you can say like the identity of an undercover operative, right? It's a secret piece of knowledge that could be potentially revealed. But there are other types of state secrets that consist of things that are known but not acknowledged. Right, so one example would be, what I started out with, the existence of the School for the Americas. Another example might be the existence of the Israeli nuclear weapons program, which for some time has been anything but a secret, but which was not openly acknowledged by the US, at least until Obama's recent discussion earlier this year. Was for the first time sort of openly acknowledged that they had nuclear weapons. Furthermore, knowledge that is legally designated as secret might not even be secret in the more common sense meaning of the term, right? And I have one of my favorite examples of this is the reports that came out after the Snowden leaks and after, the Guardian published a number of these documents. So they were available online on the open internet through the Guardian website. There were reports that came out that the US government had forbidden employees with security clearances from reading the Guardian. Because if you had a security clearance, in order to maintain your security clearance, you have to maintain your relationship to secret knowledge in a particular way. And if you, without permission, access secret knowledge that is classified as secret by the US government, but has been posted on the Guardian, you are in violation. Right, so I as a citizen could go online and read these private secret documents, but if I work for the government and have security clearance, I'm barred from reading those. So that illustrates, some of the very interesting social ways in which state secrecy is constructed. Okay, furthermore, secrecy, and here again related, thinking particularly about state secrecy, speakability and exposure transparency, as I suggested already. I think we should all think of them as existing in relation to one another. Secrecy and exposure only make sense as practices in relation to the other. And so how should we think about these issues methodologically? Well, as I suggested, one thing we ought to do is to take the construction of these relations between secrecy, exposure and transparency, and speakability as an object of our research. And in particular, that we should examine the social and political construction of the boundaries between what is secret and not secret, what is speakable and what is not speakable, what is exposed and not exposed, and how these boundaries change over time as itself an important site of analysis.
Thank you. Can I invite the first question from the audience, please? Thank you. Yes, over here.
Hey, my name is Kiri Aiken. I'm at the University of Bath doing my PhD. Dissemination of extremist content. But obviously, terrorists and extremists are very politically loaded and subject to abuse when you are essentially censoring certain messages. And I wondered, beyond, you mentioned sort of quantitative means of monitoring stuff, I wondered what qualitative ways there are, or what kind of criteria essentially are used to say this is an ISIS account and will be removed.
Yeah, so it's kind of like the extreme content that appears on the account. I mean, if you post about a specific kind of, this has just happened, then that's fine, but it's continuous content. So what we kind of see from ISIS accounts is obviously the images that get posted as well. It's a lot of propaganda type images. Then we can go through kind of the public messages, and then it could be that extreme content as well from that perspective. But it's not a case of, Twitter itself has its criteria. I work as well with the UK government. I work with numerous governments around the world as well. But Twitter itself has its own kind of content and guidelines that you do follow. That's publicly available. You can actually see that on their website. And that's how we kind of flag the accounts from a terrorism perspective. There's other kind of categories as well that's actually on the site that accounts do get suspended for or get removed for. So that's the data aspect that I'm kind of looking for.
Next.
I'm sorry, my question is for you as well.
Can you make sure you say who you are and
My name is Tom McManus at Queen Mary University of London. I'm interested in Telegram you say to use instead of WhatsApp. Could you explain a little bit about why that is so? Because as I understood it, WhatsApp was encrypted at both ends. But also, could you tell us what email accounts we should be using, where we should be storing cloud storage, and if there's such thing as a free VPN server?
Well, I wouldn't use a free VPN service. I'd use a paid VPN. I use private internet access. It gives me access to pretty much any country around the world. I get an IP address. It's high latency, so we can actually see the data downloads are a lot faster. In regards to what was your two previous questions?
Email and
So
cloud
Pushmail.
storage. Sorry?
Pushmail.
Pushmail?
Yeah, so that's another email service that we use. In regards to cloud storage, there are numerous kind of encryption methods out there. So you can actually use, for instance, Google Drive. You can use a service which actually encrypts your entire Google Drive, and you have a specific key, and obviously you need that key to then decrypt your files. So you can actually encrypt any kind of cloud service.
Would you use Boxcryptor?
That's Boxcryptor. That's what I use.
Okay.
I mentioned, yeah.
And can you tell me why WhatsApp when we understand it
Yeah,
to
because
be...
with WhatsApp, we tend to find a lot of people have it downloaded but haven't updated to the latest
Right,
versions.
yeah.
So whereas Telegram, I mean, encryption's been there from the very start. So the reason why I said I'd use Telegram, I mean, from your kind of perspective, obviously you've downloaded the latest version of WhatsApp. We're using kind of the desktop messengers that's just been released. Whereas Telegram from the get-go has always been encrypted, even the desktop versions as well as the cloud version has been encrypted. So that's my only worry is a lot of people, especially in like low economic areas that do have access to kind of WhatsApp and you're speaking to sources, it's not updated, they haven't updated to the latest version.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes?
I'll miss you out, Chairman.
Again, say who you are. where you're
Steve Wright,
from. Yeah.
spoken for. Incredible panel. I won't speak to your stuff because I'm still trying to imagine what worlds you're inhabiting. And I thought that Leila kind of grabbed it for me when she effectively talked about uneasy ethics. Because I think the two other speakers speaking about torture, there seems to be some responsibility on what do you do with the data. I mean, as far as I can see, you've got torture and the torture treaty which you can't abrogate from. So everything we do as researchers is going after the people that have broken those laws, despite their rationalisation saying it doesn't apply in time terror. Yes, it does. It's like paedophilia. You cannot say, I can do that and not be illegal. And I think that when you're talking to people that have broken the law, or you're gathering data on them, the end point is prosecution. And I think that there's an issue here in terms of the UK, because what you were talking about in terms of how officials are rationalising this, if they enter European soil, we're not barbarians here. We have laws that they have broken, and our duty as researchers is to prosecute them. It might be interesting academically to talk to them, like the Nazis. I mean, we had a speaker, Rex Blumstein, was interviewed and got the archive on the Nazi legitimation. But the end game is prosecution. I just wondered how the speakers felt about that in terms of making black and white, saying our duty is to the victims and not the perpetrators, and we have to kind of find a way of bringing them to justice using our research.
Melanie, do you want to respond first?
I understand what you're saying, but on the other hand, as you very well know, the law is not black and white. It never has been. And in fact, if anything, law is servant of power, and it has been in every instance. I mean, the law has been, the basis of the law has been completely redefined in order to make torture acceptable in the United States, for example. So the extent to which the law can actually function in prosecuting the torturers is questionable. As to whether or not it is my duty to pursue these people, to get them to be prosecuted, well, it's quite interesting because, again, I have absolutely no power in so doing, and some of the people that I have spoken to, the world knows about what they've done. You know, the only reason that some of the guys who were involved in dodgy interrogations would talk to me was because they had already written mea culpas or repentance letters, often in places like Washington Post. The world knew who they were and what they'd done. Nobody had prosecuted them. So I think I'm thinking in an ideal world, you would want torturers to be prosecuted, but A, the law has constantly changed to redefine the meaning of torture, and B, law has always been servant to politics, and that's even the case in Europe, where, for example, some prosecutions have happened of these instances. But even in Europe, for example, universal jurisdiction laws have been scrapped in order to allow American and Israeli people involved in all sorts of war crimes to come to Europe. So, you know, I don't know. I mean, again, ideal world versus the reality.
And the other speakers? Sorry.
I don't know if that was directed at me because I'm not doing first-hand interviews on this project, and I'm not actually exposing, you know, any information that isn't already known. My project that I'm currently working on is actually, you know, sort of looking at what has been exposed, you know, as well as said, what is known, and you know, trying to understand how it is that this information can be publicly known, and yet, you know, sort of people are not prosecuted, sort of trying to get at that problem. So yes, I mean, I agree, ideally, you know, sort of the end game would be prosecution, but you know, I feel like the knowledge I'm producing is not anything that's not already known. It's more to try to understand how we're in this situation where the laws don't work, in a sense, in the way that you would hope.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the work I have done is being used by litigators. I'm not optimistic about prospects of prosecutions of those responsible, or of victims being adequately compensated for their suffering. So, I mean, the litigation varies because some of it is litigation against specific states around complicity. So there's been cases in the European Court of Human Rights where the court has required a state to account for itself and to investigate its own involvement. Now, the effectiveness of that is open to question, and you know, what are you going to do? We live in this is politics 101, right? It's a realist world where states can do what they like, and they can ignore international bodies that might try and hold them to account. By contrast, there are cases where, because of the type of work that, you know, not that I'm doing through litigation, because I'm not qualified to practice as a lawyer, but where my work is informing litigators, they can stall certain more nefarious processes. So one of the reasons these sham trials at Guantanamo are taking so long is because the defence for the victims, for the prisoners there, are managing to halt those processes by continuing the questioning and challenging what's going on. Do I have a duty as an academic to do those things? No, that's personal. I went into a career in international relations because of a conviction I have around human rights, but that doesn't mean I can hold all other academics to that same standard. You know, that's my sort of normative motive as a private individual, that I've gone into a world of work where I can make choices where I hope that I might make a difference. I'm not stupid or naive though. I mean, the tiny little contribution I might make may help someone a little bit. It's not going to change the world. Doesn't mean I can't have those aims. And on the British case, I mean, I've got an article just about to be published, which is tracing the level of British complicity in this. And I've only been able to make those arguments because for 4 years we've forensically looked at Britain's role through all the declassified documents, all the flight data and everything else. It will be published open access because I work in a university where they're willing to pay huge sums of money so that my work can get out there. You know, so there's a hope that people will read it. Is it going to make a blind bit of difference to the fact that the British state has been a torturing state for decades or centuries? No, of course it's not. But does it raise questions about what the purpose of the law is and how the state can challenge and circumvent the law and try and get around the law? And if I can shed light on how states are trying to manipulate law, then that is something I do want to share with students and other academics and with people who are thinking about these difficult questions of how contested the law is. Thank you.
I just like to add a question to it. Do we actually ever look from a research perspective to do with kind of the black ops side of it? So the fact that a lot of people use the analogy of states or use the analogy of governments, and governments tend to point the blame on the people, and the people tend to the commanders tend to point the blame on the individuals who was carrying out and following out orders. Now I know from kind of a victimization perspective, obviously someone had torture committed on them, and yeah, I feel sympathetic for them. However, the people that are actually inflicting this have been brainwashed or kind of put forward by the government or by their commanders to actually participate and do this as a normal kind of working life. So do you guys, from an academic perspective, ever look at the impacts that you have on that individual or their lives for actually exposing this that potentially happened?
Yeah, so one of the scary findings for us when the Senate published the redacted 500-page executive summary of the investigation into CIA torture was that it contained an appendix with the names of all the people who've been through the programme. And I mean, Sam and I and the people who we work with at Reprieve and the other litigators in the US and the UK, I mean, we pretty much know the rendition story inside out. We've worked on it for years. And there were names, and there are dozens of names in that list we've never seen before. And, you know, we've done a lot of work finding out who these people were and counting for them. And there are, you know, 3 dozen or so, 4 dozen names of people we've never come across. And there are various explanations as to why they are not. One, we don't know anything about them. The first is that they disappeared into the CIA rendition program and are dead. The second is that they were released into countries where there just is no human rights litigation, and therefore their case never came to light. The third possibility is they're still in prison somewhere, so continue to be held secretly. The fourth, a very plausible possibility, is that some of them were turned. So some of them are now working as informants for the CIA. And there is then a really important ethical question about what I do as a researcher.
Yeah.
Do I try and find out who they are? Because if I do, I potentially put their lives in danger. I could try and do that work and then not publish it because actually it put their lives in danger. But I think even by just trying to find out about them, there are certain risks, and there might be all sorts of reasons why that's not a good idea.
So with your research perspective, do you take into consideration the fact that the military and governments train people in specific kind of operations or specific tasks that aren't actually relevant to what they carry out as a role or job? So some people do carry numerous roles per se.
Yeah.
So do you take that into, because obviously you can get a guy that has a family and has a wonderful wife, and he could have been trained in specific kind of areas. That shouldn't bring them down as kind of a personal perspective, because the media nowadays jump on that one individual and kind of build up from that individual. My opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think anyone who's doing research on people who carry out coercive interrogation and torture, you know, I would hope would also understand that this is a person who's trained in a particular type of institution. Yeah. One is to consider what that institution is for. So, you know, the CIA was completely divided about the question of torture. This is not well reported in the press. But there are dozens of people in the CIA, both analysts and operatives, who try to expose what was going on because they were so opposed to what was happening. So I think to treat members of the CIA as all a bunch of evil torturers would be incredibly naive. So yes, I think as academics we have a duty to be responsible in how we think about people in organisations and institutional bureaucracies and so on.
And perhaps it's the systems as well, not just the individuals. Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
Identifying within the CIA or other government sectors, you'll have kind of a specific task force that are designated to a specific thing, and they'll conduct their own operations around that specific area. Now, however, they might not inform another task force that's within the CIA, and that's what you tend to find. A great analogy or an example that came out was, I remember, was the hacking team. The guys that develop software to maliciously kind of intrude on individuals for privacy. A good example is if you look at the buyers of hacking teams, or people who bought the software, you'd see like the Department of Defence, then you'd see this specific task force in the Department of Defence that bought like a £200,000 licence. Then another task force would have bought a licence. So they're not using each other's licences, they're doing their own specific operations. But it's like, it kind of flips it on its head to do that side of research as well, so that the effects from within the kind of honeycomb sector, if that makes sense. The way I kind of describe it is obviously like a beehive, you know, like we've got different kind of ones.
It's interesting, yes. There was another question here.
Yeah, it's not as much a question as maybe more of a comment.
Name where you're from?
Nicole Rascal from University of Sheffield. And also in journalism as opposed to acting. I went to a conference similar to, not similar in topic, but just kind of a day lecture about journalists and analyzing data and how they can start to affect change publicly. And one of the beauties of academia is having this protected space and the time, and as an academic, having this amazing analytical mind to be able to take so much data and put it together and analyze, 11,000, saying things, and get to a point from it that journalists often don't have the time or patience or headspace or anything to do. And I think it's so important, everybody's topics of research that they do, and in academia, you all know, everyone's kind of focus or research can be so specific, and they can spend a lifetime researching something. So I'm kind of, this idea of being an activist versus an academic, I'm kind of thinking, can we start to put the idea into academia that you can be an activist? Or to get
Who is this directed to?
No, it's just kind of an idea, touching on his comment of,
Yeah.
do you feel obligated to have the end result be prosecution or something? Just to kind of put out there, maybe activism kind of can be filtered in to the idea, because I think academia a lot kind of stays in its own data sharing and information amongst themselves. It doesn't offer it out. Just kind of want to put that idea out there.
I want to come back because I was too cruel by saying you've got a duty. And what the speakers, I thought it was an incredibly valuable session because the speakers are saying, well, we've got this jigsaw puzzle piece, but in your talk particularly, in terms of what couldn't be debated before now can be debated. Another interpretation is the idea of prosecuting the torturers. Seems like not realist. Yeah? Well, that's what I want. I want a new ethos which says research activism, taking the point of the lady behind me, that we have inklings where we think, even though we don't know it, we're sleepwalking. We say, the jigsaw puzzle that I've gathered through my work, these other people won't see it the way I see it. That's a piece of evidence. And there's people like Lee Day saying, you were there, you knew. The Italians have already given us a pathway because the Italians have said, we're going to prosecute the CIA. Now that's not realist, but they've done it. And if the CIA operatives enter Italy, they will be jailed. Now that's like a new paradigm, and I think maybe that's one of the outcomes of this meeting, is that we say, is it unthinkable to see ourselves as research activists, where we can change policy
Can I say
and culture?
something to that, please? Because I think that there's a difference between being a research activist and being a prosecutor. I actually think that the ways in which our research could be more effective than almost anything else is not necessarily feeding into an Italian-style prosecution of the CIA, although that's wonderful, but rather raising awareness publicly, because ultimately what changes such circumstances are very often not prosecutions or court juridical solutions, but public mobilization against them. And I think that it's hugely crucial for public mobilization for people to have information. So if I'm an activist, it's not because I want somebody to prosecute somebody else. I actually think that the people who should be prosecuted are not low-level torturers that I interviewed, but rather people like Rumsfeld or Cheney. And that's never going to happen. I'm sorry, it just isn't. So for me, what is much more important is for the public to understand what is going on, for there to be mobilizational movements to do so. One of the greatest lawyers who has prosecuted a number of these kinds of cases, and who just died a couple of weeks ago, Michael Ratner, said specifically that the only reason he did these kinds of cases was to raise public consciousness, because he realized that those kinds of cases did not really end in results that could have benefited the majority of the public. What worked was political mobilization. So I think if we are going to be activists, our view should not be towards the courts, it should be towards political mobilization, public mobilization.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that, and I guess I would say, in terms of my research, right, sort of what's driving me to do the particular research that I do is, right, sort of it's not about, I'm not trying to trace, sort of who did what to when who, that would feed into a prosecution. I'm trying to ask questions about the political situation that makes it possible in the US for there to be consent or perhaps, sort of divided consent to torture, right? How does that come about? Because I think the only way we can have change is if there, is not public consent, if there is massive public mobilization against these practices. And so, that's my object of study really is the realm of public discourse in terms of what I'm studying, and how that shapes the nature of public consent to what the state does or doesn't do, which I think is different from some of the other projects we've been hearing about.
Very important. Bruce.
Yeah, just coming back on your point actually, because I think you're absolutely right. As academics, we do have the luxury of time to do this research properly and to carry out these, in some cases very forensic studies of the sorts of dirty things the states are doing. And for me, the kind of public information side of this is ensuring that my work isn't exclusively published in academic articles that my students will be forced to read and a few other people might choose to read. It's about ensuring that I can disseminate that in as many different ways as possible. So the website was one way of doing that. Identifying a newspaper with a friendly journalist who cares about the story because he's covered it for so long was another part. And we got fantastic coverage of that story through looking up the Incubator and Guardian. And so it's finding those individuals who are frankly much better placed than I am to write for an audience in a particular way that it may mobilise public interest. And so I suppose there's ways of being an activist researcher that really thinking about, well, what are my talents and how can I identify people outside, whether that's in the NGO sector, in the legal world, in the media world, who can tell the story that we're researching.
That's interesting.
And I would say that your case is an excellent example of that. That there's so many topics that kind of just stick quietly. So I would hope that more academics take the route that you've taken to kind of get it.
A lot of luck involved.
Any other questions? Yes? Say your name.
Omar Al-Ghazzi from Journalism Department here at Sheffield. I wanted to ask Lale and Lisa if you could elaborate more on how to research silence and silence with the mechanism of power, because it's always perhaps we're used to analyzing the utterances and discourse, but a lot of the time it's the silence that's actually more powerful.
If I may, the person to address that question to, and he's written an entire book about it, is the amazing researcher, artist, photographer Trevor Paglen. He has a wonderful book called Dark Spots on the Map. And what he does is he essentially researches absences and silences. So one example that I really love giving is that, in the US budget, it's often a document that when it's published, it's about this thick, right? Each line item essentially has an explanation. It's a document that's this thick. And so much of it are classified stuff, which doesn't actually indicate that, not so much of it, but it's a certain proportion having to do with the intelligence agencies and the Pentagon, have line items where the line item itself is a complete absence. So what Paglen has done is to calculate departmental budget, so the Pentagon's budget, for example, overall, and then search out those absent line items, and through sort of sub-calculations, discover what the classified amount is that is not listed in the budget. He's done this with a number of other things. For example, he's done it with following satellites, getting astronomers to help him follow satellite trajectories in order to figure out which one of the satellites, which doesn't do X, Y, or Z, is for example, a spy satellite. He's done this with underwater cable tap points where intelligence agencies have done this. So his book would be something that I would recommend. In terms of the silences that I've researched, exactly what Lisa said about what is secret is not necessarily unknowable or unsayable. These things are said and known often, and so I think that in some ways what you just do is you try to find narratives or locations or other sources that could verify those things that people remain silent about.
And just very briefly, I wouldn't say that I'm researching silence. I would say I'm researching what is said. But of course, then, right, sort of what's really interesting is sort of, right, sort of the boundaries between what's said and what's not said and how that changes over time. So I would say my method is, right, sort of to look at what is said, but then from that you can extrapolate what's not said, right? So 2 examples from my research, right? One is that, right, sort of, the main question is, sort of how the permissibility of torture, right, becomes suddenly so debatable after 9/11, right? You have public discourse about it, and you have legal memos about the permissibility of torture, right? Before that, you can say that suddenly you had those, that previously you didn't have those. So that's one form of silence. Another is, right, sort of you can look at the sorts of things that are said and then extrapolate, well, what's not said. So for example, the Senate committee report on torture, right, came out. One of the things that I, sort of concluded from reading it is, right, sort of, I found it rather peculiar that most of the debate in that report, at least the sections that were released, are on the question of, who knew what when, and was the information accurate, and, sort of about, sort of what was happening. What wasn't there was very much debate over whether or not torture is permissible or not, right? It was all about the technicalities, right? So that's, sort of, that's another way of thinking about silences, so that's sort of how I'm thinking about that in my research.
Thank you, Lisa. Anybody else? No? Yeah?
Oh, I've already asked a question, it's all been but I'll ask another one if it's all right. I was going to ask if anyone, I guess particularly Ruth, maybe had experiences of essentially being approached by someone representing the government and, or maybe not so crude, but pressured to frame things a certain way.
I'm really very dull. It's 11,000 rows of data, no one cares. No, but the reason is that, there are 3 reasons why not. The first is I'm working with data that's in the public domain. I've got very little that is stuff I can't share or that isn't there already. The exception is some testimony of some victims shared with lawyers, which have been shared with us confidentially. Otherwise, everything's out there. It's just that I did a good job of mapping it. The second thing is, I am in a Western university. I have an Anglo-Saxon name, and I'm not a practicing Muslim. But you reckon I could have done this research if any of those things were different? Really, really difficult. And that's a silence in higher education. But for Muslim scholars, or scholars from the Middle East, who aren't necessarily in nicely insulated Western universities, don't necessarily have this luxury. And actually, if they were in the States trying to do this, they could be in more trouble. And then I suppose the third thing is, which is a bit crass, but my little black book contains the names and telephone numbers of people like Clive Stafford Smith, because I work with this organisation. So probably my human rights are going to remain intact, but the higher risks are for the people I'm working on.
Thank you. Yes?
From the documents that came out of Argentina, that one of the objectives of the camps was to actually not kill people, to let them go so that they could explain the terror to everybody else. So that was one of the state's aims. And it was kind of a surprising discovery. And one of the issues it raises is if we are researching that and disseminating it, then we're doing what sometimes the governments may want. And I don't know if anyone has ever come across anything like this or have ever had to think about this before disseminating the work.
So, I wrote a book on state terrorism, so guilt is charged. But I think actually, again, what we can write about now in terms of state terrorism, it's known. The stuff isn't secret, and of course, people who are victims, their families already know. So in a sense, that's not a dilemma I think I necessarily face, because what I'm doing is trying to tell a story to a wider audience about that, so that more people know that these illegal things are happening.
Thank you. And Jamie?
Do you think why the public look at your data that you gather, why the public kind of want to read that data? It's a little bit more of a feeling.
No, nobody wants to look at 11,000 row spreadsheet. They don't have to, because there's a beautiful interactive map that we built with The Guardian, which makes it much more fun to play with torture data.
But did you talk about that over a long period of time, or was it a case of like 3 weeks went by?
No. So the website had something like 350,000 unique visitors with, I can't remember the bounce rate exactly, but I mean most readers are looking at 3 or 4 pages on the website, reading the material, and plenty of them are interested people in the public, and that's been over a really long time frame.
So it'll be interesting to look at kind of a government IP address perspective to see how many employees within the government actually visit that website and how the bounce rate was during that time.
I suspect it's very low.
Any more questions? Any more questions? No? Well, thank you very much to all of our wonderful speakers. This has been a really fascinating panel. Thank you.